Let me just say from the beginning, one of the points that I'm going to make, and I'll say a little bit more about this later, is that I think we need to be clear and reflexive about the variation in our ideological approaches about equity. There is quite a bit of diversity in thinking about how we approach equity, and so as an ethnographer who likes to be reflective, I'm going to tell you what my standpoint on it is. And what I mean by that is really focused, and I think this quote captures it very well. I take this from the work of Lynn Barden, who's done quite a bit of work on special education and disability populations. And I want to beg the question, why should we care about inclusive education? And as he writes, I am not, or many of us are not concerned with the assimilation or accommodation of discriminated groups or individuals within existing socioeconomic conditions. It's not about making people as normal as possible based on a middle-class logic, and often in the United States based on a particular racial or ethno-racial middle-class logic. And it is not about an end in itself, but it's a means to an end, about a transformation of society. The interest is with all citizens, as the question was raised last night, their well-being and security. It is ultimately about the formal institutional arrangements. I'm not reading, but paraphrasing, of course. And education is one of those key social institutions. This means changing in values, priorities, and policies that support and perpetuate practices of exclusion and discrimination. That's the perspective from which I come when I talk to you today. In the research that I've been doing, I've been thinking conceptually about two kinds of fundamental structures in our schools. We've spent a lot of time talking about the mobility context, or what we call the resource context or the opportunity context of schooling. And I'm going to tell you what we generally talk about, and many of us refer to in a minute, but I also want to draw your attention to the sociocultural, and I should put political context there of schooling too, because I would say that these two dual structures actually contribute to the schooling outcomes that we have. And the bottom one, the sociocultural domain, is the one that is much more difficult to ascertain if we are not within schools daily. We can pick up some cross-sectional data on surveys, but we really can't get it without going deeply behind the scenes in schools. So what do we mean by the resource or mobility context? And that is often implicated in between school analysis, which schools have more resources or not. But we can also see some of this within schools, as on one of the formal slides that Carol presented this morning from Linda's work was about actually within so-called integrated schools, we can see that there is differential access to certain resources. But generally, these are the kinds of things we're talking about. The variation in teacher quality and experience, school leadership differences, the quality of the physical plant, access to library, computing resources, books, things as simple as toilet paper in the bathrooms, per student spending, student-teacher ratios, is small size, class sizes versus large, what kinds of offerings, of course, test score performances, how well is a school doing based on the assessments that we generate. And then often we're looking also at attainment patterns, the tertiary or college, tertiary education. It doesn't just have to be college or university, but vocational as well. But here's where I'm spending so much time, as I mentioned, and I talk about the social cultural context because it's understood when we go deeper within schools. And I want to share with you some of the data from the study that I've done and some of the kinds of conclusions I'm coming to. Well, first of all, we can understand that one of the indicators really about the cultural logic of a particular school is going to emanate from who's in the school, right? And the kind of tensions or the kinds of convergences or divergences that occur based on the socioeconomic, the racial, ethnic, gender, language, religion, immigrant versus native. All of those things actually complicate the sociocultural context of schooling, and we're grappling with how to be educators within those very diverse contexts. But we also, in addition to thinking about that, we need to pay very close attention, I would suggest to you, to various kinds of indicators within what I call the academic climate as well. Some discussion has been made about the academic ideology and beliefs. One of the things that I hear continually, and I do think that there is some tension, is that we actually, it was said this morning on the first panel that we actually know a lot, and while innovation is important, we need to implement what we know. And one of the questions I wanted to ask is, what if we don't know or are not reflexive enough about our own social location to be able to admit that we're having trouble actually educating within these particular school contexts? And what is it about our own social location that can also influence the ideological viewpoints we bring into schools about what students should know, what intelligence looks like, what is competence? Right? So there was the issue that came up, I heard someone say this morning, about, well, what about these communities who don't necessarily think that the thresholds that we hold as high achieving are worth aspiring to? Where do those issues come from? And who sets the thresholds? These are very, very complicated questions. We don't all share the same worldview around them. And I think that's where a number of our tensions come from, particularly as we think about cultural logics of schooling. We also know from the literature that there are differential expectations about particular social groups. What is being created, I know from what I hear students say, are master narratives about the abilities of particular groups based on the data we generate. And in some ways, we're unwittingly reinforcing large-scale discourses about people's ability because we're continually refueling the conversation, retooling it based on the so-called achievement gap data. And so I want to just put that out there. We're also seeing across the schools various differences in the approaches to learning and pedagogy. One of the things that I write about in my provocative paper, my provocation paper, is the idea, if I had to go through my data, my thousands of pages of ethnographic notes, and tell you the most recurrent term that's used among students to talk about learning and engagement, it is the idea of what boring. And, you know, and one of the things that we know, and I draw on the work of Sir Ken Robinson around this, around how is it that we're cultivating creativity and expression in schooling today, I will suggest to you that we are continually mapping an old school or traditional logic about what schools are about, the kind of assembly line mill model. It still persists in many of American schools. And students are becoming fundamentally engaged in this contemporary era where they're stimulated externally by all of these different kinds of technological advances. Like, what do we do with that? And I won't go into Michelle's turf on that, but I'm certainly just giving you an entree there. The third variation or variable that I found as we went behind the schools is just the differences in the political, civic, and moral context of schooling. The discourse varies about the functions and purposes of schooling. Right now, we tend to generate a signal, for the most part, that schooling is a means to an end, i.e., economic advancement or mobility. But I had a very big debate engaged in a debate with a group of African-American boys at one of the schools in my study. There were 8 of them, African-American and Latino. And there was this very precocious, civically engaged young man who was a part of a program, what we call voluntary desegregation in the United States. There are 9 districts in the country that actually have formal programs of voluntary desegregation. We've quite resegregated in the U.S. But for 40 years, this school has been partaking in a program where low-income African-American and Latino students from a central city are sent to an affluent, mostly white suburban high school. And they've been doing this for 40 years. Now, they have a commitment to cultural difference in this particular school. But that commitment to cultural difference really just means spatial proximity and the exposure of these kids to a better resource context, without actually taking into account, and this is where the tension emerged as I was there, the differences in the social and cultural material realities of the kids. So what we had was this school sending, for example, 100 youth on a 2-week study trip to Japan. Or they would send their orchestra or their choral groups to Austria or Latin America, all over the world. But the kids who were a part of this VDP program could not participate. Or were not participating, one, for financial reasons, but 2, because the school hadn't become vigilant about the extent to which particular extracurricular activities and curricular activities were becoming boundaried and associated with particular socioeconomic and racial ethnic groups. And so one of the things that I now am talking about is how vigilant are we about the actual symbolic and social boundaries that emerge in our schools and are correlated with extracurricular and academic practices. In the schools that seem to be the most effective with particular historical disadvantaged populations are the ones who take what I call a radical egalitarian approach and are vigilant about the divides that come in terms of tracking or just even voluntary association with particular things that are conducive to academic mobility, like engaging in extracurricular activities or taking a certain type of science class or math class and not associating these with a particular group. So we do see in some of our schools certain minority or visible minorities, as you say, actually starting to self-select out of these various venues within schools because they don't see them as conducive to their own educational attainment processes, when we actually know that they could be quite rich experiences for them. Now, mind you, in other school contexts, however, depending on how vigilant the educators are, we see those very same social groups having radically different educational experiences. So a lot of it is about the kind of ideology and the focus on practice that we bring to the school context. Another dimension within the sociocultural context of schooling is really thinking, and this is just coterminous with what I've just said, the organizations of students. Where are they sitting? Where are they placed? How are they interacting? What are the intergroup dynamics that are emergent within the context? We don't tend to talk about those things. Why are all the ex-kids sitting together? In some cases, when I would go into schools, why are all the ex-teachers sitting together? I had to actually figure out as an ethnographer where to sit oftentimes, and it was a political decision, or it could have been fraught with political implications. A final domain that I want to suggest to you are the implicit and explicit cultural codes, the rules, the norms, the allowances. One of the things that we are seeing in our majority-minority high schools that are struggling, actually, let me just say, in my study, almost all of the schools are actually solidly performing high schools for their particular context. But comparatively, there are differences between the more affluent and the predominantly white and the majority minority schools. And we're discovering in terms of the culture of schooling is that in the relatively higher performing majority minority schools, it's a more militaristic and stronger disciplinary context. Whereas when I go into the affluent, suburban, predominantly white schools, there's more trust embedded, there's more lenience about students leaving campus or even eating food in class. You don't see that in the higher performing minority schools. And so we're actually taking on an entire kind of different context around discipline, about rules, about norms, about allowances in schools. And one has to beg the question of, well, we see good test score results, so if it works and it ain't broken, we don't tend to pay attention to it. I'm just going to put it out there that it is quite curious, and it is something that I think we could talk about in schools that don't perform certain practices. The signaling of academic competence and intelligence. I cannot tell you how much certain symbolic actions actually signal to children or youth whether or not we feel that they are worthy or if it's worthwhile for them to participate in certain educational activities. And a lot of it is very implicit in our interactions and what we say, what we talk about. The most engagement I got with high school students when I would go into these schools, particularly the visible minority students, is when we would have incredible conversations around social inequality, sociological discussions. So it does beg the question of how much are we talking about the other multiple functions of schooling in some ways, and how much are we engaging students around various topical areas as opposed in the United States to just taking the kind of testing and drill exercises that bored the devil out of me when I was in the classroom half the time. So one of the things that we did, and I'm almost done, in terms of our study, and I just kind of cite a paper that I just published here, is we're finding that when they're in the schools, when the cultural context is one that we see representation across the spectrum in the schools in terms of activities, in terms of engagement, that majority minority students in the United States, in my case studies, tend to have higher self-esteem, greater course participation, and greater attachment to the school itself. And what is ironic about this particular finding is it is not in our most affluent schools where this is happening. It is in the majority minority high-performing schools where that representation is more spread out, as opposed to the majority white schools where the students are now segregated within the context and are not represented in Model UN or participating in the orchestra or taking AP or honors courses. And so the representation of other students like them, it's not there, and they tend to reinforce or reproduce those boundaries because they don't see others like them, and so it must not be for me, but it must be for those other groups. We don't seem to find that happening within the other school context. Now, compare and contrast, in all of the schools that we've done, we also have the flip side, where our whites, and many of them are middle-class students, are in the minority as opposed to the majority. What are their levels of incorporation like compared to when visible minority students are in the minority? And we see very distinctive differences. One, because of the racial and class logic in the United States, if we want to keep high-performing minority schools and keep whites invested in them, we have to make sure white students maintain a certain status within those schools. And so there's much more active recruitment of those students within the upper echelon of classes, within certain political extracurricular activities, in school leadership. This is one of the main findings we have. They're having very different experiences as the minority, although there are these kind of social psychological kind of similarities that happen. But in terms of the actual engagement in the school, their experiences are very different when they're the minority compared to when Black and Latino students are in the minority of the school. So some concluding thoughts about the project of school equity from drawn on the research that I've done. I argue that to fully understand it, we need to pay attention to both between and within school patterns, practices, and experiences by the various group types. We have to pay attention to the duality of both cultural structures, or what we call, access, equity of practices or processes, as well as to the kind of material structures, the equity of access, of resources and such. Contend with the logic we uphold about schooling. The kind of general dominant achievement ideology is that schooling is just a means to an end, and we signal that to school students, and today's students are often disengaged from that logic, many of the students that I encountered. Assert and practice the multifold practices of schooling. Education, indeed, I would suggest to you, constitutes a public good. It's not just a private good or the development of human capital, and students are debating about these things, but are we engaging them with these kinds of ideas within our classrooms? Be vigilant about the social organizations of students within schools and how this organization reproduces social boundaries. It happens at the symbolic level, and it happens at the very real kind of actual practice level in terms of where we have students sorted within the school in the United States. And then I would suggest to you, based on what they're saying and what I've observed, we reformat the models of teaching and learning so they're not narrowing this conceptualization of knowledge to make school so boring, because right now in the United States it's just about a culture of pencil and bubble test, unfortunately. And so we have students like one, I call her Darlene, who will say to me, they don't care about us anymore. All they want us to do is perform well on the test so that they can look good, meaning educators. And so I actually have evidence of students who are saying that they're bowing out on the test now as an act of resistance, because they don't feel deeply engaged with the educational context. And so I will stop there on that provocative little kernel of evidence.